Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I think everybody who was in the waiting room is now in on the call. So I'm Paul Linden. I'm the principal investigator of TAPAS, our Tackling Air Pollution at Schools Network project. And welcome to our lunchtime seminar series. Just a couple of housekeeping statements, which for those of you who've been here before will have heard before. Please stay on mute during the presentation, and perhaps keep your cameras off just for bandwidth matters. We're recording this seminar, so if you don't wish to be recorded, you should stay muted and with your camera off. And please put your questions in the chat, and we will pass them on to at the end of the presentation. Okay, so I think that's it. It's now my pleasure to introduce Matt Croucher, who is from WSP. He's the specialist in zero emission mobility with experience in all aspects of sustainable transport and low emission vehicles. And he's been working on air quality and carbon reduction programs for schools and nurseries for the Mayor of London. And he's going to talk about this, I think, in his presentation today. So I'm going to now just hand over to Matt and let him take it away. Thank you, Matt.
Great, thanks, Paul, and thanks for inviting me on to speak today. Yeah, so I'll be presenting on two projects today. So the first was looking at primary schools on behalf of the Mayor of London and the GLA team, and a subsequent project which then went on to look at nurseries and the impact of air pollution on those. So I'll just start going through the slides. So yeah, so my background, as you'll have picked up in Paul's introduction, there is very much from the transport side. So I'm a transport planner by profession, and I specialise in zero emission mobility and looking at the impact of transport emissions around sites, including schools in this case. And we, as a multidisciplinary organisation, then have within the team specialists in air quality and local air pollution, and on the buildings and property side of things as well, when it comes to looking at indoor air pollution and measures that can be applied. So it's very much a kind of cross-disciplinary effort, because to tackle this kind of issue and come up with deliverable solutions, it really needs to have that kind of cross-disciplinary approach informing what we do. So just to set the scene a bit in terms of how this work came about. So the Mayor put a real emphasis on tackling air pollution as part of one of his manifesto commitments, and declared a public health emergency. So as part of that, it was highlighted that over 400 primary schools across the Greater London area were in areas that exceeded legal pollution limits. This was in 2017 when this was first launched, and 25% of primary schools were in areas with dangerously high levels of air pollution, even if not quite over legal limits. And primary school children are amongst the most vulnerable to the effects of poor local air quality, which is why it was a particular area of concern and a particular target for their policy and initiatives. And you can see in the newspaper clippings that it's got quite a lot of coverage at the time of the announcement. So the air quality challenge is obviously a significant one, and merits real attention, and drew the attention of the Mayor for a number of reasons. So the increased mortality that is associated with longer term exposure to air pollution, increased morbidity and illnesses such as cardiopulmonary diseases and asthma and so on, and then also the financial costs of the health impacts through lost productivity. Road transport makes up a large part of the NOx emission at the roadside, and a large part of that is diesels from diesel vehicles. And something I always found shocking when we first started working on this was how diesel fumes have relatively recently been classified as a grade 1 carcinogen, so a definite cause of cancer, and the World Health Organization declared them to be carcinogenic in the same category as asbestos and mustard gas. And yet, many of the schools and nurseries that we'd look at, you'd have major kind of sources and exposure to these emissions by young, vulnerable children at a place where they spent a considerable length of time. So clearly, kind of emphasis behind needing to get this right and address this. So in terms of the scope for what we were tasked with looking at, this went out to tender, and we were fortunate enough to be successful with our tender, and were asked to audit 50 schools across London. So the schools are highlighted by the stars there. So predominantly kind of central inner London, where the emissions, the air quality levels were poorest, but there are a few straying out into outer London, as you can see. We're tasked with these 5 different points. So identifying sources of outdoor air quality and potential exposure to those, identifying, evaluating and recommending a combination of kind of hard-hitting measures as well as some more pragmatic, kind of more deliverable measures, engaging with the school children and community to raise awareness more generally around the issue of air pollution, engaging with the London Borough Council officers and other relevant stakeholders to inform the recommendations, and then ultimately providing those recommendations as a bespoke set of measures for each of the 50 schools to address the issues they were facing. A further point here was to establish a robust process and toolkit for the audit process more generally, the idea being that can then be used by the other London boroughs for other schools. So this is just the first 50. There's obviously many more schools than that. So this was looking to establish a repeatable approach. So that was a big part of the work as well. So 3 broad stages to completing an air quality audit as defined by the approach that we developed for the GLA. So the first stage is pre-planning and scheduling of the actual audit itself. Then you've got the field work and engagement, where we actually head out to the school or the nursery and build on that desktop analysis with real world kind of observations and discussion. And then you take that away and develop the recommendations and reporting, where we draw in at that point the expertise of our colleagues across different disciplines to input to those recommendations. So I'm just going to walk through the different stages and what they consist of then. So stage 1 is all about understanding the local context. What we're looking to do here through some initial desk-based analysis is make sure that the auditor, when they head out to site, has as much information to hand already, so that they know what to go and investigate in more detail whilst on site. So this is just an example of some of the outputs that we report on. So here we're looking at simple things like the number of pupils and the current mode of travel to the school. We look at the catchment area, so how close are the children typically travelling in from? What scope is there for them to potentially not drive in and walk instead? How do the staff travel in? What are some of the major sources of emissions around the school? So we'd look at things like bus frequency. We'd look at major pollution sources like industrial estates or other things like that, stations, non-transport related sources we're looking at as well, of course. And we plot all of that in a form like this. So the auditors are going in well equipped to know what the wider context is around the site. And what we're looking to do is part of the first audit, for the primary schools, the scope was very much focused on nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter. So specifically those types of local air pollution. A very useful data source that we used extensively for the London air quality audits was the GLA's published maps of modelled air pollutant concentrations, the London Atmospheric Emissions Inventory data set, which you can see here, showing the concentrations and how those drop as you head out from the denser central London area. At the time of writing, the latest data set that was available for these ones was the 2013 data, which is what you're seeing there. Obviously, there are more recent ones available now. And what we would do is then look at where exposure is greatest around each of the 50 schools. So we'd take a site like this. So the school is just under the letter B there. And we would look at how the mapping drops onto that. So we would click through like so, and then we'd see where the levels of pollution are relatively good and where they're poorer. And what we're trying to understand and capture through the assessments then is to understand where exposure is worse, so where it's dependent on the location and duration of where the children are. So we're looking at where their playground is, where they travel into the school, where they'll spend significant amount of time, where classrooms might face onto areas of high pollution, and if they therefore open the windows, they're more exposed to that. And making sure that we've identified all of those sources of emissions and what contributes to those. And we'd basically ask that same question of the children. So those couple of slides I just worked through there are the engagement activities that we would do with the children. So we would show them their school, and we'd show them 3 places around that school, and we'd ask them, based on what we'd already talked to them about in terms of as what causes air pollution, local air pollution, where they thought the most polluted areas were. And that was always really kind of well received by the children. They really liked engaging with that, good kind of levels of interaction there. And just coming back to then the methodology. So some of the other key things we would look at for each of the sites, as I was touching on, is what in terms of the passing traffic, we would look at what the composition of that traffic is, which is the pie chart on the right. So to what extent is it made up of cars versus buses versus heavy goods vehicles and so on. And then we would look at the transport emissions split by source sector. So you can see that whilst in this site, 79% of the vehicle traffic is car, they only make up 36% of the emissions, and it's actually buses, for example, that make up 22% here, yet they only make up 2% of overall vehicle movement. So you've got a disproportionate effect of heavy goods vehicles and buses. So that would be something we would tend to look out for in particular, as well as things like industrial combustion sources. So there's a petrol station near this site and a railway line as well. So that's the kind of desk-based analysis. We then would have the audit itself, which would typically be around half a day spent on site at the school. And that would consist of a number of different steps. And you can see one of our team here, Fiona, busy auditing this school. So we'd always make sure we're there for peak arrival or peak departure, because what we're wanting to see is what the children are experiencing as they arrive or depart the site, because that's when you get that typical kind of flurry of activity at the start or end of the day, where you may get parents parking up, parents or guardians parking up near the gate, idling their engines, or creating potentially kind of dangerous environment for the children as they arrive into the school. And those things are all very useful for us to observe, because we can seek to try and design those out within our recommendations. And then you're potentially removing sources of exposure to emissions, and you're potentially making it a better environment for children to travel to school sustainably if it's not currently a very good environment conducive to doing that. So that's when we'd be looking to capture some key information. We then typically move through the school and take a look around at the external kind of layout of the school, understand where the playground is, whether that's exposed to any sources of emissions, how long the children spend there, where they move through the space. We'd always look when we're making these observations. So a point just to flag is it would always be important that we do that with the school staff and with the borough officers. So we'd always attend the school audits, and we'd be accompanied by a member of the school staff, often the head teacher. And that's important, for one, so that the children knew who we were with, and that we were, we were kind of not a concern to the parents, but also so they could tell us what happens throughout the year. So we are very conscious that we're only seeing the school for, a snapshot. It's just a few hours within a day within the year. At a different time of year or on different weather conditions, you'd probably get very different behaviour. So we were keen to learn from them whether what we were seeing was representative of a normal day, and kind of inviting their input. We'd also invite the same from the borough officers, who had a lot of experience in the kind of wider goings on around the school as well. We then do an internal site walk where we're looking at the layout of the school, understanding again where children spend significant amount of time, so the classrooms and where they do PE and so on, and to what extent they are potentially exposed to incidences of high air pollution. So as part of this, as I mentioned, we are looking to develop a repeatable approach, so that beyond just this initial program, boroughs could go ahead and audit their own schools. So we've developed this series of templates that can be completed throughout the audit process. We would then have probably, I would describe as the most key part of the day, beyond actually observing what's happening, is the brainstorming. So this is where we sit down, having made those observations of what's going on in and around the school, with the school staff and the council officers. So there tend to be kind of 5 or 6 of us around a table. And we'd be discussing what we see, trying to make sure we capture anything that we've not seen ourselves on that day, but which is an issue as far as the school is concerned or the borough officers are concerned. And then we're starting to brainstorm possible measures and possible solutions. So it's obviously important that we don't just go away and write a report based on what we think, which in practice would be completely undeliverable. So we would run ideas by them based on what we've seen, and they may say, okay, yeah, we think that's got some mileage, that might work, or no, we've tried that doesn't work for whatever reason. No, you can't, we can't kind of have people arrive at a different time because of such and such constraints. So it's all of that kind of stuff we're trying to capture within the brainstorming session. So that ends up being invaluable for when we come to make the subsequent recommendations. So the next figure here was just looking to then, so this is just an example from one of the reports of where we're bringing together everything we observed and plotting that on a figure to show issues identified. So they would be split out into highways issues, school grounds issues, and school building issues. And you can see they're kind of color coded between the 3 types there. And we're really here just trying to capture everything that we've seen, so that it can then inform the development of practical measures that can be implemented. And I won't dwell on that school specifically, but I'll just come on to a summary of some of the key recurring issues that we saw across the school audit program. So on the highway side of things, so in the in the area immediately around the school, some of the major issues we tended to see, and some of the recurring trends between why these schools were identified as having being exposed to high air pollution, is that they very regularly had heavily trafficked roads. And road transport, as we saw earlier, makes up about 50% of all NOx emissions in London, so that's a major contributor. Many of the schools were on particularly busy roads, strategic roads, which then carry large numbers of buses and sometimes freight activity as well. And as we saw, they tend to contribute disproportionately to emissions. But often also the case as well that there were pockets of congestion or queuing traffic. So then you've got the emissions emanating from those vehicles as they pull away from a junction or from a standing start, and they'll tend to accelerate quite hard, and it released a kind of burst of emissions. Or there were quite often incidences of rat running past schools, where people are bypassing congestion elsewhere on what would otherwise be quite quiet roads. And if that corresponds with when the school children are arriving, then you've got obviously a conflict there. Some of the other recurring issues we saw were hostile environments to pedestrians, cyclists, and scooters. So if you had a fairly kind of chaotic drop-off activity of the children, it would tend to create quite a hostile atmosphere, which would then discourage people from traveling to the school by scooter, walking, cycling, and you end up with that kind of that feedback loop there of people kind of being put off traveling more sustainably, and so you kind of spiral into higher levels of car travel. And associated with that is engine idling. So we'd often see around the school gates, so the areas where you've got the highest concentrations of children walking along, along the curbside, relatively kind of low down to the road. You'd also see incidences of parents and others stopped in their car, parked but idling their engine. Construction activity was quite notable at a number of the sites, with large-scale developments going on. So you've got all the big HGV traffic associated with that, but also the plant and machinery on the site, and all the dust that's thrown up through a construction site is really quite noticeable at a number of the sites as well as some other major trip attractors near some of the sites. In terms of the school grounds and the buildings, so playgrounds and outdoor spaces were something we tended to kind of put quite a lot of focus on as well, and these were often quite exposed, sometimes nothing more than a chain link fence separating the playground from a busy kind of passing road or other sorts of emissions. Children waiting to enter the school ground, sometimes the school couldn't open its gates before a certain time because they would have to then staff the playground earlier than they had staff to do so. But it meant in the meantime that children were waiting in a particularly kind of high area of exposure. The other thing we tend to would then look at in terms of the building is things like the ventilation. So obviously quite a lot of the schools are brilliant kind of old Victorian buildings, but what it tended to mean is they're reliant on passive ventilation or natural ventilation. So lots of doors and windows flung open, and for the classrooms at front immediately onto a busy road or other pollution source, there's clearly kind of worsening the exposure through doing so. Poor insulation and aging boilers were some other features as well. So we would tend to see that where the insulation was particularly poor, it'd mean that they'd have then the boilers on full blast during the winter, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to control that very well within the classroom. So you'd have the boiler on, but also the window open, so worsening exposure. And during the summer months, because the poor insulation, the rooms would overheat that much more quickly. And again, you're having to kind of fling everything open and worsening exposure by doing so. Right. When we then come to developing the solutions, another strand of the project was to develop a toolkit of measures for improving air quality. So what we developed was a really quite comprehensive toolkit, I think, with over 100 measures split out into these different categories again. So some addressing highways related issues, some addressing school grounds, some addressing school building, but we'd also look at behavioural measures as well, which are a quite significant area, and then wider measures beyond the remit of the school, the council, kind of a governmental level measures. And within that toolkit featured a number of precedents and examples and case studies, which proved very helpful when trying to explain different measures to schools and councils. And that's publicly available. I've pasted in the web link to that. There is actually a later version of that I'll come on to as well. So this was the version published in 2018. You can see as part of the primary school audit. So we did update that for the later program. So then we'd have a similar story. We would look to kind of plot the solutions, the proposed solutions for each of the school, categorized in the same way. And some of those common recurring measures then just summarized in these next couple of slides. So very much we're advocating that a holistic approach is needed for each of these schools. So there's no kind of one silver bullet. It really does require intervention across all of the different areas that we've looked at, and involves a number of stakeholders. And we found that there's really a package of kind of quick win, lower impact solutions. There's quite a number of things you can do which will make a small difference and are relatively quick to deliver. Some are within the gift of the school to deliver. Others are things that the borough council can do relatively quickly. But alongside those, there are a number of medium and longer term recommendations, and these tend to be the ones which will in themselves make a larger difference, but are equally more challenging to deliver. So if you're looking to do things like, reduce vehicle access along a street, or redesign the highway, or make significant improvements to the building structure, obviously there's cost and time associated with those. So it was kind of that balance between those two types of intervention. So on the highway side, I won't go through all of these because there's a lot here, but buses were a major one. So we saw buses obviously a good thing in themselves, and they enable people to travel via public transport and not via private car. But the nature of their bus fleet, certainly at the time of the audits, was that they're generally quite old diesel vehicles, and made up a disproportionate share of overall emissions. So cleaning up the bus fleet becomes a very important kind of strand of any recommendation. And since the audits first began and those were reported on, there's been significant progress made in that respect. A large number of low emission buses and Euro 6 diesel buses have been rolled out, which are a significant improvement on what was there to date, but there's certainly more to do there still. Whole load of stuff to do around freight, around potentially restricting access to larger vehicles on some routes around schools was a recurring recommendation, and engaging with local businesses where they're nearby and potentially could consolidate some of the deliveries, use cargo bikes and so on. That takes time to make that work, but they're things that should be tried. Broader measures to promote sustainable transport are very important as well. So small measures like footway widening and curb build outs, improved crossing facilities and traffic calming, just to kind of reclaim that space, particularly immediately around the entrance to the school, away from motor vehicles. So to put more distance between them, reduce the incidence of engine idling, or reduce, or at least remove that from immediate proximity to the children, improve the walking provision, so you can kind of achieve multiple things through some of those measures. School streets and restricting or reducing traffic were a key measure as well. When I'm pleased to say that since we first started recommending these and they started to feature within the audit reports, we've seen a real uptick in the rollout of those across London. And a school street is where you restrict access to only residents who already live on the street can leave, but no one else can enter or exit the street for a kind of 45-minute window or 30-minute window either side of the school arrival departure time. So you're creating a kind of nice environment immediately around the school gates at that time. Parking and loading restrictions, and trying to promote things like park and stride, so to displace some of that parking away from the immediate confines of the school, and just rebalance stuff towards promoting sustainable transport. A lot around construction activity as well, and trying to make sure that construction, new developments when going through the planning application process, have to meet higher levels of delivery and freight emission standards, and that's given due consideration when they're near a school as well. And just a couple of pictures of some of those types of measures in place there. And on the school grounds side, a major kind of strand to the recommendations, one that was very popular with the schools generally, was around green infrastructure. So particularly where there are exposed playgrounds fronting onto a busy road, introducing some green screening around that was a very popular measure, because it not only creates a bit more of a barrier to those particulates, but also creates a much nicer environment within the school itself, and in some instances helped with kind of security issues in that the playgrounds were overlooked, and it provides that extra bit of privacy as well. So they tackled a number of issues beyond just air pollution. Reducing time in exposed areas and promoting sustainable travel, other kind of recurring issues, recurring recommendations. And then on the school building side, a whole host of things really, ranging from upgrading windows and aging boilers in some of the schools where this was very much kind of needed anyway, and introduces small improvements that may lessen the need to then incur natural ventilation. Air filtration systems I'll come on to more in the next part when we move on to talk about the nursery program, as we looked at those in more detail. But they've certainly kind of got a role to play. And then reducing incidences of overheating and air conditioning in some cases as well. And again, just a few images of some of those measures in practice. On the behaviour change side, so this is where the schools were particularly kind of, it's something they are able to implement themselves more directly. So promoting some of the measures like park and stride and car sharing, and reducing engine idling. There's a lot they can do around there, and we were able to flag a lot of material for them to use on that. And then wider measures that kind of go beyond the bounds of the borough councils alone. So targeted scrappage schemes, which the mayor has since introduced, and campaigning to reform vehicle excise duty and introduction of zero emission zones and so on. Oops. Yeah, and there's just a few examples of those kind of programs being promoted. So key findings from the first program, from the primary schools program, were collaboration is completely fundamental to making these work and making them worthwhile exercises. There's no point them being an exercise by a consultant coming in and saying we think you should do this. It's very much the case that it needs the school to be informing that they know what will work and what won't work at their school. So it's a case of collaborating with them, running ideas by them, and inviting feedback and arriving at a sensible set of measures together, and completely the same on the council officer side. Stakeholders know their area best, again, so just emphasising what I said earlier. Us parachuting in there and for half a day and however much desktop preliminary analysis we'll do, we won't know the area better than they do. So it's, again, kind of taking that on board. And a multidisciplinary approach, as I touched on right at the start, it really does need to draw on expertise across a range of technical disciplines, was our view, because there's identifying the sources of emissions for one, but then there's identifying practical measures that can actually be implemented is the other. And some challenges with borough interdepartmental working on the council side was certainly a challenge in a number of cases. We always wanted to try and have representation from multiple officers representing different departments to get that rounded perspective, but there can be challenges in achieving that. It's certainly something we come across at times. So just to re-emphasize the point I made around multiple interventions being needed, each producing a small benefit, but cumulatively adding up to make a real difference. So quite a number of the measures in isolation, we certainly wouldn't suggest are going to kind of be transformative, but that's why there's quite a number of smaller recommendations as well, trying to strike that balance between being deliverable and making a difference. Right, so I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try and speed through a little bit. So some of the solutions can be low cost and quite quick to implement. As a recurring concern was about cost, and actually, again, making sure that these aren't just recommendations that sit on a shelf in a report, that they can actually happen. So quite a number of them can be implemented as low cost trials, and here's an example of a school street where it's a simple case of some bollards being added in a road and some signage, and that can be trialed, and if it works, it doesn't need lots of expensive infrastructure necessarily. And yeah, others like play streets that you're seeing here, where the school is just the street is closed temporarily to allow activities on the street. Again, it doesn't need to be expensive as such. So final stage is then just the reporting of that. And again, I've posted in a link here. So these reports are all published online. There's one for each of the 50 schools, and then an overarching one for summarising the overall school programme. And there's the toolkit itself as well, which I showed earlier. And an event was launched with the mayor to kind of conclude that programme. So in terms of legacy, so additional funding was then announced to implement some of the recommendations, which is brilliant. And we've seen the schools busy kind of going away and implementing those. We've got lots of great pictures to see that those measures in place, as well as on the borough council side. And the councils match funded the funding contributions as well. So it generated some really good momentum, and we've seen some really good kind of sharing of ideas through the different schools at forum events that are hosted. They were hosted by the GLA and are now hosted by GAP. So that's ongoing several years after this began now, and the whole audit approach was cited by the Chief Medical Officer in her annual report on health impacts of pollution, which is a real endorsement of the GLA's approach, I think. So many councils have now taken on this audit approach and are applying it to their own schools. So we know of Westminster and Brent and Suffolk are just about to do the same. And the Mayor went on to commission from this initial programme a further air quality audit of 20 of the 20 most polluted nurseries, which I'm just going to run through now quickly as well. So there were 20 of these shown by the triangles. Again, these mainly kind of central inner London nurseries were selected. And this largely followed the same approach as the school air quality audit program by design. It was intended to kind of take that methodology that's developed, running through the steps that we talked about before. The main difference was only that the scope in terms of types of emissions considered was broadened, so that it also considered PM 2.5 and volatile organic compounds, VOCs. And it placed a greater focus on indoor air quality. So those were the kind of two points of difference to the preceding programme. So as part of that, some baseline air quality monitoring was also within the scope of works that the GLA tendered for this one, and an air filtration system trial. And this came about from the first programme where we'd recommended this for a number of the schools, and it featured within the toolkit, but there was relatively little published data and information about the efficacy of air filtration systems in a real world school nursery environment. So the GLA were keen to wrap that into this study to provide that kind of independent summary of how effective are these units. Is it something that should be considered in schools with levels of indoor air pollution? So yeah, the audit reports for that programme were published at a mayoral event in March 2020, which was one of the last times I've been out on any work-related outings since lockdown. It was just before lockdown really kicked in. And funding and match funding was awarded to the nurseries again to go ahead and implement some of those recommendations from the study. We also produced an updated toolkit of measures alongside an air filtration system trial report and a programme report. And again, these are all available on the GLA website with the link posted here. So just going to say a bit more about the kind of different elements to this project in the 4 minutes or so I've got left. So we looked at in the 20 nurseries. Initially, there was baseline air quality monitoring, where we'd look at nitrogen dioxide using diffusion tubes, VOCs, and formaldehyde. So for each of the nurseries, there'd be 5 diffusion tubes. They were positioned at different sites around the nursery. So one at the roadside, one immediately outside the nursery entrance, one in the playground, one inside the nursery building near the entrance, and then one inside a classroom. So you kind of had that range of sites. And just in terms of a summary of the results we got back from that, as you'd expect in terms of the NO2 readings, these drop off with distance from the roadside. So for working from left to right, the roadside emissions you can see are really quite high for some of these. The highest reading we got, I think, was 63. And then it drops down to the point where inside the classrooms, it was consistently lower, as you'd expect, to the point where they're generally kind of not too high a level. Some incidences of high VOCs, but typically were within guidelines. You can see it's a number of red ones there, but generally were within limits. And we also saw that the modelled outdoor data from the LAEI database that we use generally matches with the measurements that were taken, and the PM levels were high in each. So seeing reasonable consistency there between the model data. So just briefly, in terms of the air filtration system trial, so this was a 6-month trial, and the aim was to understand the effectiveness of air filtration systems at reducing key air pollutants, so NO2, PM10 and PM2.5, in real-world nursery environments. And the real world is kind of involved there just because of what I'll show in some pictures in the next slide. So what we were looking to establish was the overall effectiveness of these units, as well as reporting on things like their costs and maintenance, and really what their practicability was for nurseries, should they want to go ahead and install them. So 6 of the 20 nurseries were selected, and a different air filtration system was installed in each of the 6 to test how they perform. And the real world element comes in, where we're looking at some of the classrooms where they were sited. And you can see that typically these all had kind of open windows and doors. The children come and go out of the doors all day, so in a free flow kind of play way. So these are not kind of laboratory conditions where the air filtration systems will perform at their optimum. These are compromised situations, and so it's a question of, do they work effectively in these circumstances? So these are the 6 nurseries that were taken forwards for testing, and their 3-month averages during the initial baseline. So we reviewed the available air filtration systems on the market, and 6 were selected to be taken forwards for the trials based on a number of parameters that we assessed them against here. They were given a weighted score against each. The testing then used passive diffusion tubes and Zephyr continuous monitoring devices to establish the effectiveness of the air filtration systems over time. And the results were encouraging. So there was a fair bit of skepticism, I suppose, in some quarters as to whether these would really work given the nature of the environments. But we saw that there was a consistent reduction in PM2.5 removal across each of the sites, you can see there, and in some instances a reduction in NO2 as well, but less consistent on that side, but a consistent kind of reduction on PM2.5. And you can just see one of the nurseries here was Columbia Market, and you can see the kind of general difference between the red unfiltered classroom. So we had one classroom with no filtering, which was monitored, so I should have explained this, and one classroom which did have an air filtration system and was monitored as well. And then we compared the differences. So it's not perfect because the classrooms are not identical. We tried to pick the 2 most identical in each of the nurseries, but they're obviously not identical rooms, slightly different conditions, but it enabled us to make a reasonable comparison. And yeah, so the summary of the findings were a clear reduction in PM2.5 when compared to the control classroom. Overall, the weekend traces were typically lower when compared to the weekday, reflecting the lower activity rates when the classrooms were not in use. So you haven't got the kind of comings and goings, the open doors and windows, the kind of activity that disturbs dust and so on and unsettles that within the room. The reductions in nitrogen dioxide concentrations measured by the diffusion tubes showed less distinct differences, no substantial increase in NO2 concentrations, but not a substantial decrease either, so a bit more uncertain on that one. And in terms of ozone results, very little evidence that ozone was generated by the air filtration system units. The other key point to make around the air filtration system trial was that actually, because the indoor air pollution levels were relatively low to start with, it did present some challenges to the units because they're only able to show so much of a drop if there's only so much pollution to begin with. So that was quite an interesting finding in itself, is that whilst these 20 nurseries of the 6 selected were all in very kind of polluted locations, the indoor air pollution wasn't actually that high. But this was a relatively small study, so some interesting findings there. And we went on to then publish all of the GLA went on to publish all of those as I mentioned in spring last year, and I've just posted in the web link there to that wider program. And within that, if you scroll down, there's then various boxes you can click on to open the exec summary, each of the specific audit reports, or the air filtration report, or the latest toolkit report as well. And just a little clip. So something we put together was a non-technical summary of the air filtration system trial. So the report itself is quite lengthy and detailed, but we also wanted to provide something that's a bit more accessible to the schools and nurseries themselves as well, which provides some idea of pricing and so on as well. Sorry, I've run over a little bit there, but yeah, I hope that was interesting.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. Well, it was interesting, and yeah, it's a very interesting study. Before I go into the chat and read out the questions, I have a question, which is, I mean, were you surprised by anything in particular? I mean, did something come out of this that you thought, I had no idea this was going to be a problem, or?
I mean, there was certainly a lot of learning, just in terms of familiarizing ourselves, I suppose, with the kind of comings and goings and operations of the school and nurseries, and particularly in the case of the nurseries, quite how much time the children spend outside, and how free flow is the term they use is completely how they operate. And so the whole kind of point around exposure when in the playground or the nursery playground was more pronounced than I suppose we might have expected going into it, when we were more naive to how it all operated. Certainly the complexity of it as well was something that became apparent as we're going through, in monitoring the effectiveness of the air filtration systems. As I said at the outset, my background is in transport planning, so I really had no idea that the level of detail and complexities and nuances to trying to understand how effective an air filtration system would be in a real world environment, and the various factors you have to account for, and whether there'd been a deep clean take place, and whether the environment of the nursery had been changed through things being moved, or windows and doors being opened differently to anticipated. So working with our air quality colleagues on that was really interesting for me as a non-air quality kind of specialist myself. So yeah, lots of learning.
Fair enough. Yep. So we have some questions in the chat, which we have some time for. So the first actually comes from Sophie, and she asked, is the audit process that you have for schools something they can do themselves, or do they need external input and support to take them through it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for the audit process that we developed for the GLA, it's quite a technical process. So I think we would tend to suggest that, as I was kind of explaining in parts, if you want to develop measures that are going to be deliverable and account for the kind of practicalities around some of it, particularly, obviously, if you're looking at doing stuff around the school that's going to reduce some of the passing traffic flow and so on, you really at that point need engagement with the council, who can lend a kind of technical expertise on what's practical and deliverable. There are certainly elements the school can do in terms of identifying some of the common issues and some measures that are within their gift to do. But what we found was that typically it needed quite a close collaborative approach, at least between the school and the local authority. And they're a very kind of useful partner in working with them to kind of address some of the technical elements to it.
Right. Okay, thank you. And then from Paul Achaboy, he asks, have you begun to evaluate variations in classroom pollution levels as a function of how they're ventilated? For example, mechanical versus natural ventilation.
No, we didn't do that, but it's a good point. So most of the buildings, I would say kind of 80% plus of the schools and nurseries we audited were all naturally ventilated, but there were a number which were mechanically ventilated, and it wasn't something we studied specifically, but I think we did consistently see that they had better levels of indoor air quality versus those that were reliant on natural ventilation. Particularly some of the newer ones that were done to a pretty high standard. They had HEPA filters in place within the air handling units and so on. So it was something that we kind of picked up on as a trend, but it wasn't something we specifically looked at on a classroom by classroom basis. It would be an interesting one to follow up though.
Yes. Okay, thank you. And from Kate Hollis, she has two questions. She says, will you be carrying out further audits? And will the mayor be providing funds to schools that were not amongst the 50 most polluted? And second was, is there a consideration being given to increase ventilation at schools as a result of COVID? And might there be funding to assist schools in that context as well?
Yeah, okay. So to the first question, what's kind of happening now in London and elsewhere, I mean, I'm aware of a number of local authorities beyond London doing this now, is taking on the audit, air quality audit process and going away and procuring a number of those. So it is happening at a local authority level. So the GLA, really their intention was to found the methodology, kickstart it, if you like, with funding for an initial tranche of schools, and then kind of present all of that methodology for others to then take on. So I know we've just finished a program for Westminster auditing all of their schools. I think it was 90 or so. And Suffolk are about to do the same, and I think Brent have done theirs. So it's kind of transitioning from the GLA having kind of set the tone, if you like, to others then taking that on. In terms of GLA funding, I'm afraid I can't answer that. As I'm from a consultancy from WSP, so I'm not sure what their plans are going forward. But I suspect that they would be looking to the local authorities to work with the schools to find funding for that now, but enabling them to use the methodology that was developed.
Do you anticipate those results will be published, publicly available when they're done in the other boroughs, for example, and other places?
I think they will be. I know we're involved in the Westminster one, so that they're going to publish theirs on their website once they're complete, and that could be any time now, I think, over the next kind of few weeks. I'm not sure about Brent's because we weren't involved with that one. I suspect something will be available for that though, because I think they'd be sharing it with the schools at the very least. I suspect they'd want to share it more widely. Suffolk, I think, are intending to publish once they've completed as well. Yeah, although we're only just starting that, so that'll be a little while yet.
Okay.
Sorry, what was the last question?
What about COVID, I guess?
Yes. So we had in the last schools air quality forum that Gap now chair. So the one before that, we had a section on COVID and how that relates to all of this, because obviously we're looking a lot at indoor air pollution. So yeah, the kind of steer that our air quality specialist Peter Walsh, who was on that call, provided was that it all ends up coming down to ventilation. And so we were talking about to what extent air filtration systems might have a part to play in that, was the specific thing we were covering there. And they potentially do. I mean, a number of them are used in health facilities, in hospitals, and for that reason is that they are able to kind of capture and kill viruses with the UV radiation they feature. But more fundamentally, I think Peter was addressing that ventilation is a major part of it, as we've seen as the general advice, making sure there's a good airflow, good air turnover, to reduce that kind of feeling of stuffiness in a room where you're more likely to get that kind of build up. But I wouldn't want to kind of overstretch my knowledge more than that. It's not my area of specialty, but sure. I hope that helps a bit.
Yep. And from Catherine Sutton about green infrastructures. So how do schools get advice for that? I mean, there appears to be issues about sorts of trees being grown and impacts on kids with respiratory issues and so forth. How do they access that information?
Yeah, so if you take a look at some of the links, I guess I can circulate these slides around afterwards. Can I, or do I send them? You
You
make them
can send them
accessible
to
to me?
us if you don't mind. We'll put them on our website. And
Yeah, I'll double check the GLA, but I'm sure they'd be happy for us to do that. They're happy for us to present today. So within there, they're signposting to various organisations who can help with that. So one are a charity called Groundwork, who advise on things like green infrastructure. So there are some things to consider there around types of plants that are used, and they are relatively expensive to put in, and but if done well, they'll last well. They're maintained, and they'll become nicely dense and established. So there are a number of links to follow up within those reports, and there are a number of organisations who we know are particularly active in installing those and do a good job. We are never able to kind of actively promote those within the reports for the GLA, because the GLA can't be seen to be endorsing a specific supplier. But if you want to get in touch with me separately, I would be happy to talk to you about a number of the ones we know have done some really good installations for schools in London.
thank you. And I think the final question, because we are getting short of time, is about air filtration systems, and there's several questions in the chat. But basically, I think there's a question of how I guess, what's the right way to phrase this? How confident are you in your comparisons, since you've really only tried a rather limited kind of intercomparison of different filtration systems and so forth? I mean, do you think there's quite a lot of work still to be done in that area? I guess that would be the.
I think that's a fair question, a fair observation, yeah, and something we were quite keen to flag within the reporting for this. So I would encourage, if anyone's interested in reading into it a bit further, there is quite a detailed report published amongst some of the other ones I've just flagged. But we are keen to signpost in there that really it's a high level study. It moved on the knowledge base, I think, and provided a good, independent, impartial, a means of assessing what's out there. But it's there are limitations to what we are able to do as part of that study. I think we all came away encouraged that, given really quite challenging conditions, as I was mentioning, that they're not working in vacuum sealed environments that are comfortable for these units to be doing what they do. They were able to consistently demonstrate reductions in PM from already not particularly high levels. So it was encouraging, but I think there is fair to say there's more detailed studies to do, and I think the GLA were looking into that as a follow-on piece of work with a partner university. Yeah, somebody from the GLA would probably be able to advise a bit more on what's happening next there.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that brings us to a close. In fact, before I thank Matt formally, I just remind everybody that we have another seminar next week. And following this conversation, it's very relevant. It's by Doug Booker from NAQTS, and it's going to be on monitoring indoor air quality and characterizing the real-world performance of air cleaners in 20 schools. So it's probably a good segue into that for next week. So I hope I'll see you all there. And it just remains for me to thank you again, Matt, for a very interesting and comprehensive talk. And we've learned a lot from it, I'm sure. And look forward to seeing you all at the same time next week for the talk by Doug Booker. So thank you very much, everybody. And we'll say goodbye until next week.